so glad you have been with us as we have been counting down our Advent blocks, counting down till Christmas. We've been working our way all the way through the whole month of December, and today is December the 16th. We're going to put that right here, December the 16th, with our star on top of it. And I am so excited to see what we are going to be learning about today. So let's look at our blocks and let's see what we have already learned about. In the very beginning, God was with us, right? God was part of our world, and He was with Adam and Eve. And then God showed that He was with Noah when He started over, and He had Noah in the ark and kept him safe. And then God showed that He was with Abraham when He gave Abraham a crazy promise to have a son, Isaac. And God was with Hagar when she was in the desert, when she was crying and she was all alone. She showed us that we are never alone. God's always with us. And God was with Jacob when he was the trickster, and nobody thought that he was going to do what God wanted him to do. And also He was with Leah. God was with Leah even when she wasn't the one that was picked. Sometimes we don't deserve God's love, and sometimes we haven't done anything wrong, but people still don't think that we're the ones that should be picked. But God always picks us. And God was with Joseph, even with all of the stuff that Joseph went through. God still gave Joseph a dream, and He fulfilled his dream. And God was with Moses when he was through a burning bush telling him, go to Egypt, right? And God was with Joshua and the people of Israel when they marched around the walls of Jericho. And God was with the Israelites when they asked for a king, King Saul. And then God couldn't be with King Saul anymore. He was with King David, because David had a heart after God, had a heart just like God. And that's when God's showing us that He's always with us, when we have our heart searching for Him. And then God was with the Israelites and Solomon when Solomon built a temple, a golden temple for God so they could worship Him. And God was with Elijah. Even when he was the only prophet that served Him, God showed up and He said, I'm still here, I'm still with my people. And then God used the prophet Jeremiah to tell God's people, I'm still with you, and you need to just be patient because I have a plan. And God was with Daniel when he was in the lion's den. He was thrown in the lion's den because he would not stop praying to his God, right? And God was with Jonah even when Jonah disobeyed and decided to run away. God was still with him, and God had the giant whale save and rescue him. Well, let's see what is going to be. What is this? It looks like a hammer, yeah. Well, let's see what our story is going to be today with our hammer. So, Zerubbabel. Can you say Zerubbabel? Say Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel. He was one of King David's children's children. So like a great-great-great-grandson. So one of God's chosen people, but not just one of the people, one of King David's descendants. So he was one of God's people, but like many of God's people, he was far from home. Remember, God's people didn't live in the chosen land that God had given them. They had been scattered all around the world because they hadn't been following God. Do you remember? And God had told Jeremiah, be patient. You're going to be there for a little while, but I will bring you home. All right. Well, God's people lived in a land called Persia. Persia was beautiful, the most beautiful land in all of the world, but it wasn't where God wanted Zerubbabel. That was his name. So one day, God whispered a secret to Zerubbabel. He said, it's time for you to go back home. And when you do, I have a job for you. Rebuild my temple. Rebuild God's temple? Zerubbabel could hardly believe it. The temple was where God used to go to be with His people. For years, there had been no temple at all, which meant that God wasn't there. But a new temple? That could only mean one thing, that God was getting ready to come back. Zerubbabel marched straight in to see the king of Persia, and he said, mighty king, kingly king, most kingish and king-like of all kings. Can I ask a teeny tiny favor? Anything, the king said. See, God had given Zerubbabel favor with the king, so But the king liked God's people and he knew that God still had a plan. So when Zerubbabel asked to go back home and take thousands of God's people with him, what do you think the king said? Well, any other king would have said, "No way, Jose, you belong to me and my land." But God had been working on the king of Persia's heart also. And so the king said, yes, absolutely. God was using this king hundreds of miles away to bring his people home. Even though the king didn't know it, he was fulfilling what God had told the prophet Jeremiah. You won't be far from home forever. The temple won't be gone forever. Does it feel like you're all alone? Does it feel like my plans aren't working anymore? But that's not the case. I'm still with you. And I still have a plan. Not just a today plan, but a tomorrow plan. In fact, it's a forever plan, and a good one, too. It's a plan to take all of the wrong and make it right, and take all of the darkness and make it light. It's a plan to bring you back home to me. You remember we learned about that when we talked about Jeremiah and how he wrote down what God had told him to say. Well, when Zerubbabel went to Jerusalem, all of the walls had been knocked down. All of the buildings had been knocked down. Nobody had been living there for a long time. So he started to rebuild. And he started to build the temple. And it was hard work. And a lot of people didn't want him to finish. They tried to ruin all of the work God's people were doing on the temple. But God was with Zerubbabel. Even when he was far from home, even when building the temple was hard, even when his enemies tried to stop him, God was with Zerubbabel. And so the temple foundation was finished. Zerubbabel and a priest named Joshua gathered many of the people together, and they sang the same song that Solomon had sung when they built the temple. God is good, his love is better. We hope he'll live with us forever. And people sang and danced and played tambourines and trumpets. It was a loud day and a happy day. People remembered Solomon's temple, and they knew that this one just wasn't the same though. So some of the older people were crying because they knew it's not the same. They also realized something that day, that maybe, just maybe, the best way for God to live with his people might not be a temple of gold and wood. Maybe God needed to come to his people some other way. If God was going to live with his people, maybe he'd have to come to earth as a living, breathing person. Emmanuel, God with us. Zerubbabel couldn't quite figure out how God was going to do it, but he knew that God would do it. And until the end of his days, the same old song repeated in his heart. Even with this new temple, God seemed far away. So Zerubbabel was still hoping and began to pray, God, will you come to earth to stay? Does God stay in a temple? No, he doesn't.